Nancy and Richard, thank you very much for joining us today and for exploring the content of your book. I want to tell you I enjoyed very much reading it, and I'm excited for the opportunity to talk with you about it. I'd like to start with a fairly straightforward but not necessarily simple question. Why a book on hope?
It's a great question. As we reflected on why a book on hope, we were thinking about what's going on in the world today, and certainly as we look back over the last decade or so, you look at occasions of hope like Obama's election, and there was all kinds of energy and desire around him becoming elected president, and a real sense of anticipation about what it would mean symbolically for the country. And yet, while there are occasions of hope like that, and for example, another example would be the rescue of the miners from Chile in 2010, when 33 were brought up after many, many days underground, and the expectation that they wouldn't make it by many, and yet they were rescued, and the hope that it took, the anticipation that they had to have as they were beneath ground, that they potentially could live. And those stories really stirred our imagination, as well as tragedies that have marked our time. For example, certainly 9/11 has reshaped our thinking, and much more locally and much more recent, of course, the bombings at the Boston Marathon. And so what does it mean to live a life in trust and in anticipation in the midst of moments of joy, as well as moments of pain and suffering that mark our human condition and our human experience? And so the book was really born out of our reflection on many of these experiences.
I've often thought that hope is somewhat of a poor relation of faith and love. We take the three together, but hope's always one that people jump over, because faith can be clearer and love is certainly more clear, and hope is this vague thing in the middle. So there was a certain sense of trying to rescue hope too, of allow it to be seen as something that is strong rather than weak, because part of our use of hope often is, well, when everything else fails, there's always hope, and it's a last resort. We want it to showcase how it's not a last resort. It actually has to accompany every aspect of our life.
I'm not aware of the faculty of any other school on the campus collaborating in quite this way. How did the idea come about?
Well, for me, it came out of an experience I've had where I taught before in Australia of our faculty writing two books together in this way. And it was such a positive experience for the faculty as a whole. I began by asking a couple of people in the STM whether they'd be interested in doing something similar. And there was such enthusiasm for it that where I thought I might have 5 or 6 people, I ended up with 17. So I think for lots of people it was a new thing, that the people you work with and have lunch with and see every day would also be the people you're working directly with on a project. A faculty, normally everyone has their own projects, both writing and teaching, so this brings everyone together on a shared project, and it's a very positive experience. It shapes the conversations you have in an ongoing way, and it was again, as it had been for me at home, it was here a very encouraging and positive, rewarding experience.
Yeah, and I think as well that it has come to symbolize the school in a particular way, because this is a joint project, and the school, it's the first time the school has a project of its kind. And in many ways, in the process of putting the book together, we did a lot to invest in one another's research and writing, and we don't normally have an opportunity to do that with one another as a faculty as a whole. We usually have collaborators that we're working with that may be in other universities or other settings. And so it was a great grace and a privilege to be able to read the work of my colleagues, and I know I walked away from the experience just very grateful for having the colleagues that I do, and impressed by the richness of the insights and the work that's being done in our school.
In their respective chapters, the various faculty authors cross-reference each other's work, and one gets a sense that they were really working intimately together. Was this a unifying process?
I would think definitely so.
Absolutely.
Part of the process we did with the book was that when everyone finished their first draft, we met together in groups of 4 to review the work of the 4 people in your group, and then everyone did a second draft, and we had the same 4 people meet to review those drafts a second time. So there was a lot of cross-fertilisation along the way over a period of months. And then Nancy and I, at the very end, when we had the final drafts, went through every single one and drew out particular links. So we added some links between the chapters as well.
And we wanted the book to be integrated. And so we were very much wanting authors, we asked authors to think through how they might connect up what they're doing with the work of their colleagues. And so in many cases, most of the authors read the entire manuscript and were looking for places where there would be connections. So there was a deep investment really across the board.
Was it a challenge editing your colleagues' work?
Not a challenge in the sense that it was difficult or that they got to points where you thought this is just totally unusable. There was nothing like that, thanks be to God. I think what it did show was the generosity of everyone involved, because if you went to someone and said, look, this idea doesn't work, or this is just too long, or it's not clear enough and so on, I certainly didn't get any pushback from anyone saying, I'm not going to change it. People were more than willing to accept suggestions, and in fact were looking for suggestions about how they might improve their chapter. So it wasn't an ordeal by any means.
I think, in fact, it was a really great grace, because I think we, in the process, were investing in one another's work. Because it wasn't just that you and I were editing all the chapters, like you were saying. This editing was going on in groups. And so in these groups of 4, everyone would read everyone else's chapter in that group in a serious way, with attention towards editing questions. And there was a real attempt to improve the quality of the book, and I think that was received very well by everyone. And it was a grace to be able to receive that and to have others, be receptive, as you say.
And because each of the authors, and all of us collectively, are people who write professionally, who read things for journals and comment on public manuscripts for journals and other publishers, we're used to being critical. So no one was going to read anyone's work and say, oh, that's all fine and don't have to change a thing. People were critical in a positive way. They were saying, well, this would be better if you did this, and what about that? So it was a very engaged process all around.
And I think we grew closer to one another as a faculty in the process. So I think it's a gift in terms of a deepening of our identity as the faculty of the SDM.
In the book, you view hope through a variety of different lenses. Theological, of course, also those psychological, sociological, pedagogical, exegetical. Are you satisfied with the completeness of the study? First question. And also, is there any perspective on hope that you wish you could have included but you weren't able to?
Well, I think it's very rich, and there's a lot there in the book as it is. And so at some level, I would say I'm very satisfied with what's there. Of course, there's always a possibility of increasing the focus and adding other lenses. And so in a way, I'd say yes and no. I wish that we had been able to do more in terms of women's experience in the book. And there are elements of that in different chapters, but I think the book would have been strengthened if we looked particularly at that in relationship to hope. And many of our students come from the Global South. We're an international body of students in particular, as well as faculty members. And I think the book could have been enhanced had we been able to draw on that experience and to look at hope in other contexts from the context of Africa or Latin America or Asia, where many of our students come from.
I think if we had have had another 6 people wanting to be part of it, we would have found another 6 perspectives.
Absolutely.
I think what our perspectives at present are the big picture perspectives, so all of those sorts of things you just mentioned. I agree with Nancy that beyond that then are the particular perspectives that may have come from this context and that context. Now, that would have been a slightly different book, or a second half of a book perhaps, but I think what we've done is give a framework into which you could then locate other very explicit and specific perspectives. So I think it's a big picture book, and there's room for the more specific treatment of out of particular context.
You've organized your study of hope into 4 different categories or sections in the book: grounding, nurturing, sustaining, and living. I'm curious, how did you come up with that structure?
Well, we spent some time looking at a variety of different ways to organize the book. And at one point, for example, there are 4 chapters in the book written by scripture scholars. And so we thought at one point, should we put all the scripture scholars together? And that would be one way of organizing. Everybody who's working off of a systematic theology theme together. Everybody who's writing in the field of pastoral theology, should we put them together? So that would have been one way to organize the book. And so we looked at that and a variety of different ways of doing it. And then and we came to this way of organizing it, these 4 different sections, really out of a sense that it best represents a movement through the experience of hope. With the first one really in and around what is the nature of hope, and how do we get a handle around what hope is, and then a living into that hope. You know, what does it mean to journey with hope? And that really is a focus for the second section. And then the third section, that there are many experiences in life that both challenge hope and then also sustain it. And so how do we take into account that? And then finally, to look at hope as a reality now, just not simply a reality that we anticipate, after the end of life, but that hope is a practice that we experience in the here and now, and wanting to look very much at how do we continue to live that now that we've moved through a much more mature place with our sense of hope.
Mm. I think when you have as many authors as this, you are from the beginning thinking about how you put this together so that it's not 17 totally disparate perspectives. The thing was, though, as Nancy said, we had some concepts in our head like put all the scripture scholars together or divide it between theory and practice. But it wasn't until we actually really had all the chapters written that it was a bit like doing a jigsaw puzzle. You could see the parts that fit together that to give you a particular picture. And in the end, that was actually went far more easily and more smoothly than I thought it might do. So it just seemed to come together, and we were happy with what we came up with. The authors were happy with what we came up with, so we decided we weren't going to touch it again. So,
That's true. That's not easy to arrive at that often, but it was this time, yeah.
As I was reading the book, Julian of Norwich's famous words, "All shall be well," kept running through my mind. And I wonder, is that hope's ultimate goal, that all shall be well?
For me, the one way of conceiving hope, which has become really important for me, is to think about it as that which keeps us moving. And hence the contrast with despair, for example, where you just get overwhelmed and you cannot move. Hope allows you to keep moving. And the quote from Julian about all will be well does give you a sense that movement is not going to end in a place of futility. You know, you're not going to crash at the end. So for me, it's the two things. It's not just the end, that it all will be well. It's what allows you to keep moving towards that end. And hope for me is very much connected with that sense of movement.
And I think added to that for me, it really is about learning to trust the journey and learning to live with the uncertainty that marks our lives. And that's not particular to any human being, but is a reality for all of us. I mean, we all live with a certain degree of uncertainty. And how do we trust in the midst of the uncertainty that is our experience? And I think hope is really about learning to embrace that and to move with it, and to know that even in the midst of failure, or in the midst of adversities, or problems that we don't hope, that we don't anticipate, that somehow more life can come from that, even in the midst of our experiences of pain and doubt. And so I think hope for me is learning how to trust, even though I have to recognize that I'm not in control of a lot of elements in my life.
Just building on what Nancy said, I think one of the strongest things that emerges from the book is that hope is not optimism. It's not, oh, it's all going to be nice. It doesn't say that at all. And I think when Julian says all will be well, she's not saying everything will be wonderful. It is about the engagement with the reality that you have. And that's why we have chapters in the book, including Nancy's own chapter, of course, on suffering, where hope doesn't put a blindfold over your face and pretend nothing is there. It allows you actually to confront the bad stuff, but to do so in a way where you go on trusting that the bad stuff is not all there is. And hence that's what allows you to keep moving.
Is there a chapter in the book, other than your own work, of course, that has a particular meaning or significance for you?
I really, really appreciated Chris Matthews' chapter. And he wrote a chapter looking at the Gospels, at the disciples on the road to Emmaus. And their sense of just shock and horror and terror at what they had witnessed in the crucifixion of Jesus, and a feeling that everything that they had put themselves into and had invested their lives in, that it had all come crashing down. And a sense of being betrayed, feeling like, yes, but this Jesus had promised us everything. And yet, as we know from reading the story, there's a way that they come to see Jesus at the end of the journey in the breaking of the bread. And it's as if hope breaks into their lives in a way that they did not at all anticipate. And so I very much like Chris's chapter, because he's engaging certainly the uncertainty that they experienced, and just the loss that they were feeling, and yet captures well how God is the God of surprises, and that our hope gets renewed sometimes in ways that we wouldn't necessarily anticipate or be able to know is coming, which is exactly what happened with the disciples. So that chapter for me was a favorite.
I clearly enjoyed lots of them. The one that perhaps that was most helpful or encouraging for me was Neto Valiente's on the difference between utopia and what he calls utopia, spelt differently but pronounced almost the same. When we talk about utopia, it's that thing which is unreal. It's this unreal world that would be perfect. And Neto draws on the liberation theologians to argue that their vision of a better world is at the same time a critique of the present world. It's not wishful thinking, it's a realistic critique of the world as we experience it, but choosing that that's not the only way the world can be. So having a vision that motivates you to keep confronting the world as it is, out of a conviction in faith that there can be something better. But that it's not wishful thinking, that it's able, again, to confront those things that cause suffering and injustice.
Nancy, this question is for you. In your chapter, you deal with what has to be one of the key challenges to hope, namely human suffering or affliction. And I'm wondering, how is hope sustained under such difficult circumstances?
Mm-hmm. And I'm looking at certainly experiences of tragedy and defining tragedy there. And I think in the experience of knowing tragedy, while I don't write about this in this chapter, I have in the back of my mind the enormous violence and killing, especially the killing of women in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, which I've written about. And in thinking about that suffering and that tragedy, hope is sustained there, I believe, by taking the pain, that many people take the pain that they've experienced in losing a loved one, and they're able to come together in community and protest these killings in a very profound way. And in that public protest, there is hope. And that's what I think sustains hope, especially in the midst of tragedy, that it can't be an experience, our pain, we can't hold our pain simply in isolation from one another. We have to be willing to be vulnerable enough to share it with other people, share our experience, and then coming together in a public way, I think is a very hopeful, it cultivates hope. It's a practice of hope.
Richard, in your chapter, you address the church as a beacon of hope, but you also realistically, looking at the church's flaws, see the church could be an obstacle to hope. How is such an obstacle to be overcome?
Well, I think it has to be constantly overcome rather than that there's a method that you can apply, you overcome it once for all. I think it's got to be a constant process. And for me, one of the keys to that process is the willingness to be what Carl Ryland calls a self-critical church. So rather than assuming that not only is God on our side, but we're on God's side, that we have to constantly be willing to ask ourselves, are we open to be converted to what God asks of us? So rather than assuming we're absolutely doing it right, no matter what anyone else says, it's that willing to keep looking at ourselves, not in a way that is destructive criticism, but actually as an act of faith, that God calls us to something more than what we've experienced or enacted at the present. And the more we're willing to ask those questions of our own actions and our own behaviours as to what degree are they really motivated by the Spirit and reveal that Spirit, then we can look at ourselves and recognise our need for change. And the more we confront that need for change, I think it's not about we can be a source of hope for others if we're perfect. I think it's the willingness to keep moving. And part of that movement in this instance is to acknowledge our need for conversion. And it's the embrace of that movement that, for me, can make the church a source of hope.
One of my all-time favorite books is Thomas Merton's New Seeds of Contemplation. And in that book, he offers what I consider a stunning definition of despair. And of course, despair is what you consider to be the opposite of hope. And I'd like to share what Merton has to say and then get your reaction. Merton sees despair as sort of an extreme form of self-love. And he says that when a person is in despair, that person deliberately turns his back on all help from anyone else in order to taste the rotten luxury of knowing himself to be lost. Now, if Merton is right, and if despair flourishes in isolation, is the remedy for despair, hope, only likely to flourish in community? And if so, why?
I believe it is. There's no question that hope is sustained in community. I think when we are alone and by ourselves in isolation, and especially when we're in the midst of confronting a horrific pain or suffering in our lives, that often what happens, we can allow that pain to fester, that suffering to fester in a way that it comes to define us in a way that robs us of our spirit and compromises our soulfulness. And I think that community calls us to recognize that we're part of something much larger and much richer and much more optimistic, well, not optimistically, but hopefully more consonant with the reign of God in our world. And that's because when we're inside of a community, we recognize that a community, we're living with a community that has had a history, a past, and that will have a future. And so there's a way we can look at that experience of community, not simply in terms of the reality that we see here before us that we're participating in, but that it really extends beyond the lifetime of the people that are part of that community, especially as a Christian community, because we're connecting ourselves to a story that existed 2,000 years ago and that we anticipate the promises of that story many years into the future. And so that community draws us out of our own pain and suffering and into a place of joy and new life.
I think the reality is that for all of us, our resources are limited. And if we are trapped in a world where there's only me, there's going to be lots of things that are much bigger than I am that I'm not going to be able to handle. And so our connection to one another is not a sign of weakness, it's actually what makes us human. And it's certainly what makes us human in the understanding of what Christian faith is about, that God constantly reaches out. And some of the literature on hope makes the point that what others offer to us opens a door that we don't know what's on the other side of the door, but at least it's a door outside of the self-enclosed world. I like the quote from Merton where he says that you get used to and get to enjoy this rotten pleasure of I'm here stuck in the mire and nothing's going to get me out of it, and I actually quite like it here. But to think that is to lose sight of the whole world that's so much bigger than we are. And it's other people who are our invitation to that bigger world.
You dedicate the book to the students of the School of Theology and Ministry, past, present, and future. And I'm wondering, is hope part of the legacy that the faculty authors intend to pass along to the students? And a second part to that question, are the students themselves a cause for hope for you and for the other authors contributing to the work?
Certainly, it is part of the legacy, no doubt. And I think the students are an enormous cause for hope, because our students make enormous sacrifices to be students in a school of theology and ministry. And in many respects, a lot of the worldly goods that other professions promise is not what they anticipate at their end of their work in our school. And so their willingness to make the sacrifices that they have to make to be part of this journey is a very hopeful sign for the world. I think it's it's hopeful for us as faculty, and I think it's also hopeful for the world, because it means that they see a vision for the world and the coming reign of God as being worthy of their lives and worthy of enormous sacrifices on their part, so that can come to be in a much more full way in their lifetimes, that they're working towards that. And I don't know what else could be more hopeful than that.
I think teachers always hold out to students a bigger world, and a world they want students to reach out towards and to move towards. So I think there's something hopeful inherent in teaching. Not that you're giving people the answers, you're actually giving them a vision that you want to draw them. At the same time, and I'd very strongly echo what Nancy said, that the students in the STM who have often done all sorts of extraordinary volunteer work and long before they get to us, something's already going on in their lives that I find consistently is for me a cause of hope. So I think, yes, we want to be a source of hope for them, but they are absolutely a source of hope for us.
The topic of your book is hope, and I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, what is your hope for this book? What do you think it could potentially achieve?
Well, I think one of the great strengths of this book is that it has a wide appeal, and that was our intention in terms of the writing of this book, that it would speak to people in the pews, faithful Catholics that are struggling with their own experience of faith and hope in their lives, as well as folks who may see themselves outside the bounds of the church and trying to figure out how do I enter into a conversation with something larger than myself that is anticipatory of something greater? And I think the book can speak to both of those groups, as well as to students who are in the academic study of ministry and theology, like the students in our school. And my hope for the book certainly is that it reaches all of those audiences, and that it makes a significant difference in the world. Going back to something that Richard said earlier, that I really hope it's able to touch people in a way that they can see a larger life than they've seen before. Those are some of the ideas I have in terms of my hopes for the book.
I think anyone who writes a book wants people to engage with it, not to stand back and say, "Oh, that's just terrific," but to actually read it in a way that gets you thinking about your own life and what might be possible, where you've come from, where you might be going. And I think this book definitely does offer those possibilities because of the breadth of perspectives that we have offered here. So what I would like is that in X number of years people are still reading it and still engaged with it and still finding the book itself to be a source of hope.
A final question. As scholars, what is your view of the importance of research libraries?
Having the resources that it offers readily available, and especially a research library like Boston College's O'Neill and our own TML on the Brighton campus, that they offer us a place to be exposed to all kinds of different thinkers and authors on any number of questions, and really serve as not only a place for us to secure resources, but also as I see the library as well as very much a symbol of the work that we do, and the development and the contribution to a world, so that the world is a better place for the generations that come after us. And I think the research library provides those kinds of resources and is that kind of symbol for me. So it's a very important institution in our life.
Yeah. We often talk about a community of scholarship and an academic community, and books are members of that community. So to actually have the opportunity to not just to get the newest things, but the whole wisdom of the tradition in one place, both the physical place, but also now, of course, all the online places. That's an extraordinary gift, and we'd be so much the poorer without it.